In the dusty courtyard of a forgotten military compound, where broken dreams littered the ground like fallen leaves, a moment arrived that would rewrite the rules of survival. The air hung thick with tension as hardened soldiers formed a circle around their newest recruits. Among them stood a woman whose quiet strength had already marked her as different, as dangerous to those who believed power belonged only to men. "Pick anyone," the Warchief spat, his weathered face twisted with cruel amusement as he gestured toward the trembling group. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind that had crushed spirits and ended lives with a single word. The selection was meant to be random, a twisted game of chance that would demonstrate his control over life and death, but something shifted in that moment. Perhaps it was the way she held her head high despite the chains that bound her wrists. Maybe it was the fire that still burned in her eyes after months of systematic brutality designed to break her will. Or it could have been the quiet defiance that radiated from her like heat from a forge. The war chief's finger, stained with the blood of countless victims, pointed directly at her. "That one," he declared, unknowing that he had just made the greatest mistake of his reign of terror. For in choosing the woman they had tried so desperately to break, he had selected the very instrument of his own destruction. This is the story of how the hunted became the hunter, how the victim became the victor, and how one woman's refusal to surrender would ignite a revolution that would burn through the heart of darkness itself. The first time Amara Okafor heard gunfire, she was teaching mathematics to 37 children in a village school that smelled of chalk dust and hope. The morning had started like any other in the rural Nigerian countryside, with the sun painting golden streaks across the classroom walls, while young voices recited multiplication tables. She had no way of knowing that by sunset, her world would be painted in blood. The rebels came like a storm across the savannah, their pickup trucks kicking up clouds of red earth as they descended upon the village of Gwoza. Amara heard the engines first, a low rumble that made her stomach clench with inexplicable dread. Then came the screaming from the marketplace, followed by the sharp crack of automatic weapons that sent her students diving under their wooden desks. "Stay down," she whispered, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "Stay quiet." Through the window, she watched as armed men in mismatched uniforms poured through the streets like locusts. They moved with practiced efficiency, kicking down doors, dragging families from their homes, sorting people into groups with cold calculation. The older men were shot where they stood. The young boys were herded into trucks to become child soldiers. The women and girls faced a fate that made Amara's blood run cold. When they burst through her classroom door, she was standing in front of her students with her arms spread wide, a human shield of flesh and bone and desperate courage. The leader wore a red bandana and carried an assault rifle like it was an extension of his arm. His eyes swept the room, taking inventory of terror and innocence with the same expression one might use to count livestock. "Teacher," he said, the word dripping with mockery, "you come with us." "Let the children go," Amara replied, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Take me, but let them return to their families." The man laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You think you have choice here? You think you bargain with us?" What happened next would replay in Amara's mind for months to come. The gunman raised his weapon toward the huddled children, and something inside her snapped. She lunged forward, not with any hope of overpowering an armed man, but with the desperate fury of a teacher protecting her cubs. Her fingernails raked across his face, drawing blood before his companions wrestled her to the ground. "This one has fire," one of them observed, binding her wrists with rope that cut into her skin. "The commander will like her." They loaded her into a truck with 12 other women, ranging in age from barely 16 to grandmothers with silver hair. The vehicle reeked of fear and diesel fuel as it bounced along dirt roads that led deeper into the wilderness. Amara found herself pressed against a young woman named Fatima, whose hands shook like leaves in a storm. "My baby," Fatima whispered, tears streaming down her dust-covered cheeks. "They took my baby." Amara squeezed her hand, offering what comfort she could while her own heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Around them, the landscape changed from cultivated fields to dense forest, taking them further from everything they had ever known and loved. The rebel camp materialized from the jungle like a nightmare given form. Crude shelters built from corrugated metal and canvas stretched as far as the eye could see. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, while cooking fires sent smoke signals into the darkening sky. The air buzzed with tension and the constant threat of violence. They were processed like cargo, their names recorded in ledgers stained with coffee and blood. A woman with cold eyes and numerous scars catalogued them with clinical efficiency, noting their ages, education levels, and physical condition. When she reached Amara, she paused. "Teacher," she said, making a note in her book. "The commander will want to see this one personally." The holding area was a windowless shed that barely contained the 24 women crowded inside. They had no beds, just thin mats on the dirt floor and a single bucket in the corner that served as their only sanitation. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of human waste, fierce sweat, and despair that seemed to seep into their very souls. "How long have you been here?" Amara asked an elderly woman who sat in the corner, her eyes hollow and distant. "Time has no meaning in hell," the woman replied. "Some days feel like years. Some years pass like minutes." As night fell, the true horror began to reveal itself. Guards would enter with lists, calling out names like a perverted roll call. The women whose names were called rarely returned the same. Those who did come back bore fresh bruises and vacant stares, moving like ghosts through the cramped space. On her third night, they called for Amara. The commander's quarters occupied a concrete building that had once been a government office before the rebels claimed it. Inside, maps covered the walls alongside photographs of successful raids and newspaper clippings celebrating their growing influence. Behind a metal desk sat a man who looked more like a businessman than a warlord, except for the pistol holstered at his hip and a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Amara Okafor," he said, consulting a file. "Mathematics teacher, university educated. No husband, no children." "Very interesting. What do you want with me?" she asked, proud that her voice didn't shake. He smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "You are educated woman. You can be useful to us. We need someone to teach our young fighters to read and write. Someone to help with our administrative duties." "I won't help you train child soldiers." The backhanded slap sent her reeling, stars exploding across her vision as she tasted blood. When her head cleared, the commander was standing over her, his face now showing his true nature. "You will do exactly what we tell you," he said quietly, "or you will discover what happens to women who think they have choices here." They threw her back into the holding shed with a split lip and instructions to report for duty at dawn. As she lay on the thin mat, listening to the quiet sobs of her fellow prisoners, Amara made a decision that would change everything. She would not merely survive this place. She would learn everything she could about its operations, its weaknesses, its secrets, and somehow, someway, she would use that knowledge to bring it all crashing down. The next morning, she began her double life. By day, she taught basic literacy to teenage boys whose eyes had been robbed of innocence by automatic weapons and systematic brutality. She helped maintain records of supply deliveries, troop movements, and operational planning. She smiled when spoken to, kept her head down, and played the role of the broken woman who had accepted her fate. But by night, she memorized every detail: the guard rotation schedules, the location of the weapons cache, the radio frequencies used for communications with other cells, the names and faces of the leadership hierarchy. She drew mental maps of the compound's layout and catalogued the daily routines that governed life in the camp. Most importantly, she began to identify potential allies among the other prisoners. Women who still had fight in their eyes despite months or years of captivity. Women who whispered plans of escape in the darkness, even knowing that capture meant death or worse. Fatima became her closest confidant, the young mother whose baby had been taken, proving to have reserves of strength that surprised them both. Then there was Blessing, a nurse who had been captured while trying to evacuate a hospital, and Hawa, barely 18 but with the strategic mind of a general who had been studying engineering before her world collapsed. "We cannot escape individually," Amara told them during one of their whispered midnight conferences. "But together we might have a chance. Even if we got out of the camp," Blessing pointed out, "where would we go? We're hundreds of miles from civilization, surrounded by jungle and more rebel groups." Amara smiled grimly. "Then we don't run away from our problems. We eliminate them." It was a bold statement, bordering on the insane. 4 women, held captive in a heavily armed compound, talking about taking down an entire rebel organization. But as the weeks passed and Amara continued to gather intelligence, the impossible began to seem merely improbable. She discovered that the camp's communications were centralized through a single radio room, manned by only 2 operators during the night shift, She learned that the weapons were secured in a concrete bunker with a combination lock that she had memorized by watching the quartermaster's fingers. Most crucially, she realized that the rebels' greatest strength, their scattered cell structure, could also be their greatest weakness if the right information fell into the right hands. The plan began to take shape during the season when the rains turned the camp into a muddy hellscape. Amara would use her position of relative trust to gain access to the communications room during the early morning hours when the guards were at their most complacent. From there, she could contact government forces and provide them with detailed intelligence about rebel positions, supply routes, and operational plans. But first, she had to survive long enough to implement the plan. And that meant navigating the increasingly dangerous attention of the camp's leadership, who had begun to notice her unusual composure and apparent adaptation to captivity. The Warchief himself, a man called Hassan, whose reputation for brutality was legendary even among his own followers, had started asking questions about the teacher who never cried, never begged, and never seemed truly broken despite everything they had done to crush her spirit. "That woman is dangerous," he told the commander during a conversation Amara overheard while cleaning the administrative offices. "She watches too much. She thinks too much. She should be eliminated." "She's useful," the commander replied. "And the men like having educated women too. Entertain them. Then let them enjoy her while they can," Hassan said. "But mark my words, that one will cause us trouble if we let her live too long." Amara knew her time was running out. The window of opportunity was closing fast, and soon she would either have to act or accept that her chance for revenge would die with her. As she lay on her mat that night, surrounded by the soft breathing of her fellow prisoners, she made peace with the knowledge that her plan would likely cost her everything. But if she could take these monsters down with her, if she could ensure that no other teacher would watch helplessly as her students cowered under their desks, if she could give Fatima a chance to find her stolen baby, then her life would have meaning beyond the mathematics she had once taught to children who believed the world was a place where good always triumphed over evil. Tomorrow night, she decided, would be the night she proved that sometimes it did. The opportunity came disguised as disaster. A torrential rainstorm hit the camp with the fury of an angry god, turning the compound into a maze of flooding tents and panicked soldiers. Lightning split the sky while thunder masked the sound of Amara's bare feet splashing through the muddy pathways between buildings. In her hand, she clutched a stolen keyring that had taken her 3 weeks to acquire from a drunken guard. The communications building stood like a concrete island in the chaos, its radio antenna swaying dangerously in the wind. Through the rain-streaked windows, Amara could see the night operators hunched over their equipment, monitoring the scattered voices of other rebel cells reporting damage and casualties from the storm. This was her moment, the convergence of preparation and chance that would either free them all or see her tortured to death as an example to the other prisoners. She had spent the previous week feigning illness, a performance that convinced even Blessing, whose medical training made her naturally suspicious of health complaints. The supposed stomach ailment gave her legitimate reasons to be up and moving during the night hours, establishing a pattern that the guards had grown accustomed to seeing. Tonight, that pattern would serve as her cover for something far more dangerous than a trip to the latrine. The key turned smoothly in the lock, a small miracle given how many of them were bent and corroded from the humid climate. Inside, the building hummed with electronic equipment that represented the nervous system of the entire rebel network. Banks of radio equipment lined the walls, their displays casting an eerie green glow across maps marked with attack plans and supply routes. The two operators sat with their backs to the door, headphones clamped over their ears as they strained to hear reports from units scattered across 3 countries. Amara moved like a ghost between the equipment racks, her 3 months of captivity having taught her to walk without sound, even on the metal flooring. In her other hand, she carried a knife taken from the kitchen where she sometimes helped prepare meals for the leadership. It was a pathetic weapon against armed men, but it would have to be enough. The first operator never saw her coming. The blade slipped between his ribs with surprising ease, puncturing his lung and sending him into silent convulsions that lasted only seconds. His partner, alerted by the sound of the falling chair, spun around just in time to see death approaching in the form of a mathematics teacher who had learned to kill with the same precision she once used to solve equations. The second man reached for his sidearm but found Amara's knife at his throat instead. "Make a sound and you die slowly," she whispered, her voice carrying a coldness that surprised even her. "Cooperate, and it will be quick." His hands trembled as he raised them in surrender, his eyes wide with the terror of a predator who had suddenly become prey. In that moment, Amara saw herself reflected in his pupils and realized that her captors had succeeded in changing her, just not in the way they had intended. They had tried to break her spirit, but instead they had forged her into something harder and more dangerous than anything they had ever faced. "The radio," she said, pressing the blade deeper until a thin line of blood appeared on his throat. "Show me how to reach the government forces. They will kill us all if they find out," he stammered. "We are all dead already," Amara replied. "The only question is whether our deaths will have meaning." With shaking hands, the operator adjusted the frequency dials and handed her the microphone. Static filled the air as she searched the airwaves for the military channel she had memorized from overheard conversations. Finally, a voice crackled through the speaker, speaking in the clipped tones of professional soldiers. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Musa, Nigerian Army Special Forces. Identify yourself." Amara took a breath that felt like it contained the hopes of every woman imprisoned in the camp. "My name is Amara Okafor. I am being held captive at a rebel facility approximately 60 kilometers northeast of Maiduguri. I have intelligence that could help you eliminate multiple terror cells operating in this region." Silence stretched across the radio waves, broken only by the static that sounded like whispered prayers. Then the voice returned, sharper now, with focused attention. "Can you verify your identity?" She rattled off her teaching credentials, her university identification number, and details about the attack on Gwoza that only someone who had been there could know. As she spoke, she watched the operator's face grow pale with the understanding of what was happening. His organization's greatest secret was being broadcast to their enemies by a woman they had dismissed as nothing more than a victim. "We need precise coordinates," Colonel Musa said. "Can you provide them?" This was where months of careful observation paid off. Amara had memorized the GPS coordinates from maps in the commander's office, cross-referenced them with overheard radio chatter, and confirmed them through conversations with guards who had no idea they were talking to someone with the mathematical skills to triangulate their position from scattered references. She provided the coordinates along with detailed information about the camp's defenses, guard rotations, and the location of the prisoners' quarters. Then she began transmitting the intelligence that would prove most valuable: the locations of 6 other rebel camps, their supply routes, communication schedules, and the names and descriptions of key leadership figures. "How many hostages are at your location?" the colonel asked. 43 women and children in the main detention area," she replied. "Another dozen or so being held separately for various purposes. We need extraction, but we also need you to move fast. They're planning to relocate some of us within the next few days." As she spoke, she noticed movement outside the window. A guard was making his rounds despite the storm, his flashlight beam cutting through the rain as he approached the communications building. Amara grabbed the operator by the throat and dragged him behind a bank of equipment, the knife never leaving his neck. "Make him go away," she whispered. "One word about what's happening here, and I'll open your throat like a book." The guard tried the door and found it locked, which was normal for the communications center during operational hours. He called out a greeting, and the terrified operator, prompted by Amara's blade, responded with a casual acknowledgement that everything was fine inside. The beam of the flashlight played across the windows for a few more seconds before moving on. "How much longer do you need?" she asked the radio. "We're mobilizing now," Colonel Musa replied. "Can you maintain communication?"
"Not safely."
"They'll notice if this session runs too long." She thought quickly, calculating probabilities and risks with the same systematic approach she had once used to teach algebra. "I'll try to contact you again in exactly 24 hours if the situation allows. If not, assume we've been compromised and move accordingly." "Amara, you've done something extraordinary here. Help is coming." She signed off and turned her attention to the operator, who was sweating despite the cool air brought by the storm. "You have 2 choices," she told him. "You can sit quietly in that corner for the next hour while I finish what I came here to do, or you can join your friend on the floor. Which will it be?" He chose to live, at least temporarily. Amara spent the next 40 minutes methodically sabotaging the radio equipment, introducing faults that would take days to diagnose and repair. She corrupted stored frequencies, damaged antenna connections, and planted bugs in the software that would cause random failures at crucial moments. By the time she was finished, the rebel network's ability to coordinate would be severely compromised. The return journey to the detention facility was a nightmare of mud and shadows. Every footstep seemed to echo like gunfire. Every movement of the guards caused her heart to hammer against her ribs. But she made it back to the overcrowded shed without being detected, slipping through the door just as the storm began to subside. "Where have you been?" Fatima whispered, her face tight with worry. "Planting seeds," Amara replied cryptically. She couldn't risk sharing the full details, even with her closest allies. Too many lives depended on operational security, and walls had ears even in a prison. The next 24 hours passed with agonizing slowness. Every time a guard entered their quarters, Amara expected to be dragged away for interrogation. Every raised voice or unusual activity in the camp sent her pulse racing, but somehow, miraculously, the sabotage went undetected. The rebels attributed the communication failures to storm damage and began the slow process of attempting repairs. When evening came again, she faced a terrible decision. The plan had been to make contact once more before the assault began, but the risks had multiplied exponentially. The communications building was under increased security following the technical difficulties, and guards were paying closer attention to prisoner movements after several escape attempts by other captives. She was wrestling with the dilemma when the decision was taken out of her hands. Hassan, the Warchief whose instincts had marked her as dangerous from the beginning, appeared at the entrance to their shelter with 4 heavily armed men. "Bring the teacher," he ordered. As they dragged her from the shed, Amara caught a glimpse of Fatima's stricken face. She managed a small nod that she hoped would convey confidence, though she felt anything but confident as they marched her toward the central compound where interrogations took place. The questioning room was a concrete cube with a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Chains hung from hooks in the walls, and dark stains on the floor told stories that no one wanted to hear. Hassan sat behind a metal table while his men positioned themselves at strategic points around the room. "You know why you're here," he said without preamble. "I honestly don't," Amara replied, and that was almost true. She had been careful to cover her tracks, but in an organization built on paranoia and suspicion, innocent behavior could be as damning as guilt. "Our communications have been experiencing unusual problems," Hassan continued. "Equipment failures, corrupted data, mysterious technical issues that our engineers cannot explain. Interesting that these problems began shortly after the storm, during which several guards reported unusual movement in the camp. Amara kept her expression neutral while her mind raced through possible responses. Denial would be expected. Anger might be suspicious. Fear would be natural and potentially convincing. "I don't know anything about communications equipment," she said, letting a tremor creep into her voice. "I'm a mathematics teacher. I barely know how to use a telephone." Hassan smiled, but there was nothing human in the expression. "Perhaps you're telling the truth. Perhaps you're not. But I have learned that when unusual problems arise, it is often best to eliminate the unusual elements that might have caused them." He gestured to one of his men, who stepped forward with a pair of pliers. "We'll start with your fingernails. If you're innocent, you'll have nothing to tell us and the pain will be meaningless. If you're guilty, well, you'll tell us everything we want to know eventually." The first nail came off with a sound like tearing paper and pain that exploded through her entire nervous system. Amara bit her tongue to keep from screaming, tasting blood as she fought to maintain consciousness. Through the red haze of agony, she heard Hassan's voice as if from a great distance. "Where did you go during the storm?" The second nail followed the first, and this time she couldn't stop the scream that tore from her throat. But even through the torture, she held on to one thought. The attack would come, whether she survived or not. The intelligence had been transmitted. The coordinates had been provided. Her suffering now could not undo what she had already accomplished. "I went to use the latrine," she gasped. "I was sick. Stomach problems. You can ask the other women." "Oh, we will," Hassan assured her. "But first, let's see how many fingers you can spare." The pliers moved toward her left hand, and Amara prepared herself for another wave of agony. But before the torture could continue, shouts erupted from somewhere outside the building. Hassan's head snapped up, his attention momentarily diverted from his victim. An explosion rocked the compound, followed by the distinctive chatter of automatic weapons and the deeper boom of military ordnance. Hassan's radio crackled to life with panicked voices reporting contact with government forces on the southern perimeter. "Sir, we need you in the command center immediately," a voice shouted through the static. "They're hitting us from multiple directions." Hassan looked from the radio to Amara, suspicion and realization warring in his eyes. "Remarkable timing," he said quietly. "Almost as if someone provided our enemies with detailed information about our defenses." "I don't know what you're talking about," Amara whispered, though they both knew she was lying. Another explosion shook dust from the ceiling as Hassan grabbed his assault rifle and headed for the door. "Kill her," he told his men. "Kill all of the prisoners. If we can't have them, neither can the government." As the sound of his boots faded down the corridor, Amara looked into the faces of the 4 men left to execute her and saw her own death reflected in their eyes. But she also saw something else. The same fear that had driven her to desperate action was now driving them. The compound was under attack, their leadership was in chaos, and they were facing trained soldiers instead of defenseless captives. She still had one card to play, one final gambit that might save not just her own life, but the lives of all the prisoners who were about to be murdered rather than liberated. The question was whether she had enough strength left to play it after the torture had stolen so much of her physical capability. The sound of gunfire was getting closer, mixing with explosions and screams as the government assault tore through the rebel defenses like a hot knife through butter. But for Amara and the other prisoners, rescue would mean nothing if Hassan's final order was carried out. She tested the strength in her legs and found enough to stand. Her mutilated hands sent waves of agony up her arms, but pain had become just another variable in an equation she was determined to solve. And the solution, she realized, lay not in her physical strength but in the psychological warfare she had been learning from her captors for the past 3 months. "You're all going to die tonight," she told her would-be executioners, her voice carrying the same cold certainty Hassan had used to terrorize his victims. "But you don't have to die as war criminals. You still have time to choose a different ending to this story." The 4 men assigned to execute Amara stood frozen in the concrete room as explosions continued to rock the compound around them. Their leader, a young man whose facial scars marked him as a veteran of countless atrocities, raised his assault rifle with hands that shook like autumn leaves. But something in Amara's voice had planted a seed of doubt that grew with every distant scream and every flash of light that penetrated the small window. "The government forces know exactly where they are because I told them," Amara continued, her voice steady despite the agony radiating from her mutilated fingers. "They know about the weapons cache. They know about the escape routes. They know about the leadership bunkers. Every secret this organization thought it had is already in the hands of professional soldiers who have been planning this assault for hours." "Shut up!" the scarred man snarled, but his finger hesitated on the trigger. "You can kill me," she acknowledged. "You can kill all the prisoners, but it won't change the fact that this camp is finished. The only question now is whether you die as murderers or live as men who chose to surrender to legitimate authority." Through the walls, they could hear the systematic destruction of everything the rebels had built. The fuel depot exploded with a roar that shook the ground beneath their feet. The weapons bunker followed moments later, sending shockwaves that cracked the concrete around them. Each detonation was precisely timed, a symphony of military efficiency that spoke to the quality of the intelligence they had received. "Think about it," Amara pressed. "Your leaders are either dead or running for their lives. Your communications are destroyed. Your weapons are gone. Your fellow fighters are surrendering or being killed. What possible loyalty do you owe to men who abandoned you the moment things got difficult?" The youngest of the 4, a boy who couldn't have been older than 16, lowered his weapon completely. "She's right," he whispered. "Commander Yusuf ran past here 5 minutes ago heading for the jungle. He didn't even look back." "Traitor," the scarred man spat, swinging his rifle toward his comrade. But before he could fire, Amara launched herself from the chair despite her injuries, tackling him around the waist and sending them both crashing to the floor. The assault rifle clattered away as they struggled, Amara's mathematical mind calculating angles and leverage points while her captor's training fought against her desperation. She had no hope of winning a physical confrontation, but she didn't need to win. She just needed to survive long enough for help to arrive. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor outside, accompanied by professional voices calling out in English and Hausa. The remaining guards looked at each other with the dawning realization that their world had ended while they were debating whether to follow their final orders. "Nigerian army! Put down your weapons and come out with your hands visible." The young fighter was the first to comply, throwing his rifle toward the corner and raising his hands above his head. The others followed suit one by one until only the scarred man remained, his weapon trained alternately on Amara and on his former comrades. "You destroyed everything," he said, his voice breaking with the weight of lost certainty. "Our cause, our brotherhood, our purpose. All gone because of you. Your cause was murdering children." Amara replied from where she lay on the blood-stained floor. Your brotherhood was built on rape and terror. Your purpose was evil dressed up in religious language. The only thing I destroyed was your ability to continue destroying others. The door burst open before he could respond, admitting a squad of soldiers in tactical gear who moved like dancers through the cramped space. The scarred man's rifle swung toward them, but hesitation cost him his life, as precise shots dropped him before he could fire a single round. "Hostage secured," the squad leader reported into his radio, as medics rushed to tend to Amara's injuries. "The package is alive and conscious." Lieutenant Colonel Musa arrived 20 minutes later, after his soldiers had swept the building for explosives and established a secure perimeter. He was a tall man with graying temples and eyes that held the weight of seeing too much human cruelty, but his voice was gentle when he knelt beside the stretcher where Amara lay receiving treatment. "Miss Okafor," he said, "what you did tonight saved more lives than you'll ever know." The other prisoners, she managed through lips swollen from interrogation. "Are they safe?" "All 43 accounted for and receiving medical care," he confirmed. "Thanks to your intelligence, we were able to locate and neutralize the guards assigned to execute them before they could carry out Hassan's final order." The name sent ice through her veins despite the warm blankets the medics had wrapped around her. "Hassan escaped?" Colonel Musa's expression darkened. "He was killed attempting to reach a helicopter on the northern edge of the compound, along with 6 other senior leaders. This organization is finished, Miss Okafor. Completely and permanently finished." As they carried her toward the medical helicopter that would transport her to a hospital in Abuja, Amara caught sight of Fatima being helped into another aircraft. The young woman's face was bruised but alive, and when their eyes met across the chaos of the rescue operation, she mouthed the words "thank you" with tears streaming down her cheeks. The liberation of the camp made international headlines, but the full story of how it had been accomplished remained classified for months. When details finally emerged, they painted a picture of intelligence gathering and sabotage that professional operators found remarkable. A captured rebel communications log, recovered from the ruins of the camp, revealed the extent to which Amara's activities had compromised their entire network. The systematic destruction of 6 additional camps followed over the next 2 weeks, each assault guided by intelligence that Amara had provided during her single radio transmission. Hundreds of prisoners were freed, including Fatima's infant son, who had been held at a facility nearly 200 kilometers away. The rebel organization that had terrorized 3 countries for over a decade was reduced to scattered individuals hiding in remote wilderness areas, but the true measure of victory came in smaller, more personal moments. 3 months after her rescue, Amara stood in front of a new classroom in a school built to replace the one destroyed in Gwoza. 37 children sat at desks donated by international aid organizations, their faces bright with the possibility of futures that had almost been stolen from them. "Today we're going to learn about problem solving," she told them, her scarred hands steady as she wrote equations on the blackboard. "Mathematics teaches us that every problem has a solution, no matter how complex it might appear. The key is breaking it down into smaller parts and addressing each piece systematically." She turned to face her students, seeing in their eager faces echoes of the children she had failed to protect months earlier. But those children's sacrifice had not been meaningless. Their memory lived on in every lesson she taught, every problem she helped solve, every mind she helped shape into something stronger than the forces that sought to destroy it. "Sometimes," she continued, "the solution requires courage. Sometimes it demands sacrifice. And sometimes it means accepting that the answer might not be what we hoped for, but rather what was necessary to protect something more important than ourselves." One student raised her hand. "Teacher, what if the problem seems too big to solve? What if it seems impossible?" Amara smiled, thinking of a storm-soaked night when impossible had been just another word for necessary. "Then you remember that every great change begins with a single person deciding that the world as it is cannot be allowed to continue. You gather your knowledge, make your plans, and act with precision and purpose. And you never ever give up, because someone is counting on you to find the solution even when they don't know you exist." After class, she walked to her small office where a photograph sat on her desk. It showed 43 women and children standing together in front of a military hospital, their faces bearing the marks of their ordeal, but their eyes bright with freedom. In the center stood Fatima, holding her recovered son, with tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. Below the photograph lay a letter from Colonel Musa, informing her that the government was establishing a new anti-terrorism training program and requesting her assistance in developing curricula for intelligence officers. The letter noted that her methods had been studied at the highest levels of military command and were being incorporated into official doctrine. But what touched her most deeply was the final paragraph, which read, "You have proven that the most dangerous enemy of evil is not superior firepower or advanced technology, but rather the refusal of good people to accept that they are powerless. Your courage has inspired a generation of officers who will carry your example into every operation they conduct." That evening, as she walked home through streets where children played safely and women moved without fear, Amara reflected on the strange mathematics of destiny. A single teacher, faced with an impossible problem, had found a solution that seemed to violate every logical principle. She had been outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded by enemies who specialized in breaking human spirits. Yet she had won, not through superior force or brilliant strategy, but through the simple refusal to accept that victory was impossible. She had transformed herself from victim to instrument of justice, from prisoner to liberator. From a woman they tried to break into the weapon that destroyed them completely. The Warchief had indeed chosen her, but not in the way he had intended. In selecting the woman they had tried to break, he had unwittingly chosen the architect of his own destruction and the salvation of everyone he had sought to control. It was, Amara thought with satisfaction, a perfect example of how the wrong answer to an equation could lead to catastrophic results. As she climbed the steps of her apartment, she noticed a young woman watching from across the street. The stranger approached hesitantly, her face marked by the same combination of trauma and determination that Amara recognized from her own mirror.
Excuse me,
the woman said quietly. "Are you Amara Okafor?" "The teacher who—" "I am," Amara confirmed. "How can I help you?" "My name is Khadijah. I was held at a different camp, rescued 2 weeks ago because of intelligence from your operation. I wanted to thank you, but also I wanted to ask if you might teach me some of the things you learned. There are still camps out there, still women who need someone to help them solve impossible problems." Amara looked into the young woman's eyes and saw the same fire that had sustained her through months of captivity and torture. The same refusal to accept defeat that had turned a mathematics teacher into a one-woman intelligence operation. The same understanding that sometimes the most important equations were solved not on blackboards but in concrete rooms where people fought for their lives and their dignity. "Come inside," she said, opening her door to reveal an apartment where maps covered the walls alongside mathematical formulas and intelligence reports. "We have work to do." The revolution that had begun with a single woman's refusal to be broken was spreading, one liberated prisoner at a time. And in training centers and safe houses across the region, former victims were learning to become victors, carrying forward the lesson that Amara had written in blood and pain, that evil's greatest mistake is always underestimating the mathematics of justice, where one determined person, properly prepared, can indeed equal an entire army. The Warchief had made his choice, and in doing so, had chosen the instrument of his own defeat. Now others would learn to make different choices, armed with knowledge and courage and the unshakable understanding that no problem is truly impossible to solve if you're willing to pay the price for the solution. In the end, that was the most valuable lesson of all.